Hey, welcome to The Explainer. So today we're going to dig into a study that really pushes back against what most of us think we know about partner violence. And I gotta say, the findings we're about to walk through, well, they might just change how you see this whole issue.
All right, let's just start with a quick question. When you hear the words partner violence, who do you picture? Just what's the first image that pops into your head? Because that immediate gut reaction, it says a lot about the story our society tells.
And for a lot of people, that story is super specific, right? The victim is a woman and the perpetrator is a man. But the research we're looking at today, it shows that the reality, the full picture, is way more complicated than that.
Let's just start with one big number. This is from a 2015 national survey in the US. Get this, 33.6%. That is more than 1 out of every 3 men. They report experiencing physical violence, sexual violence, or stalking from a partner. Just that number alone tells you there's a huge story here that we're just not hearing.
So to really get what's behind that number, we're zeroing in on a qualitative study. What that means is the researchers didn't just crunch numbers. They actually sat down and listened to the detailed, personal stories of 59 men who had gone out and tried to get help for abuse from a female partner. So we're going to follow their journey, right from their own words.
Okay, so what did this abuse actually look like? Well, the study found it wasn't just one thing. It was complex. It took a lot of different forms, some you'd expect, and some that were a lot more subtle and, frankly, insidious.
What these men described was a whole spectrum of abuse. Yeah, there was physical and sexual abuse, of course, but they also talked about really intense psychological abuse, all sorts of controlling behaviors, and something the researchers actually called legal administrative abuse. And we'll circle back to that one in a second, because it's important.
And what's really telling is how much they emphasized the non-physical stuff. This quote here just captures it perfectly. One man literally described the constant emotional abuse as terrorism. That word, it tells you right there that this kind of abuse felt every bit as damaging as any physical attack, maybe even more so.
And this right here, this quote shines a light on another major theme that kept coming up. The men talked about how the very systems that are supposed to protect people were actually turned against them, weaponized as tools for control and harm.
So this is that legal administrative abuse I mentioned. The researchers actually coined that term. And it's not just about, having a bad day in court. We're talking about the deliberate strategic use of official systems, police, courts, child services, as a weapon. And the men in this study said they felt completely powerless against it, watching the systems that are supposed to help people become the very tools used to hurt them.
Okay, so let's move on to the next part of their story. Because for these guys, just making the decision to ask for help, well, that was a huge struggle in itself. They were basically blocked by barriers from every direction, both inside their own heads and from the outside world.
The study paints this picture of a two-front battle. On the inside, you've got them wrestling with all this confusion and hopelessness, feeling like they had to protect the family, plus all the pressure from society about what it means to be a man. But then, on the outside, they were staring down this absolutely terrifying landscape. The fear that nobody would believe them, the reality that there just weren't many resources for men, and the very real risk that trying to get help would just make the abuse escalate.
This quote, it's just devastating. It captures that feeling of being completely and utterly trapped that so many of the men described. I can't leave, but I can't stay. Stuck between a situation that's unbearable and a future that seems impossible, all while feeling totally alone and carrying this huge weight of needing to protect their kids.
And just think about this for a second. The first, most logical thing you might do, try to talk to your partner about what's happening, was often a trigger that just made everything worse. The men said trying to address it could lead to denial, more violence, or even having their partner make false allegations against them.
So, this brings us to the moment of truth. What happened when these guys finally broke through all those barriers and actually reached out to formal help, the official systems? Well, the study reveals this pattern of responses that weren't just useless, they often actively made things so much worse.
So when they called domestic violence hotlines or went to agencies, the very places that are supposed to help, they said they were dismissed, flat out turned away, or as this one guy says, they were literally chuckled at. They were told straight up that those services weren't for them.
And calling the police? Often a similar, disastrous result. This quote here tells a story that came up again and again. The man is the one who calls for help, but somehow he gets misidentified as the aggressor and ends up in handcuffs himself.
Then you get to the court system, and that sense of bias just got amplified.
The men described a system where it felt like the script was already written before they even walked in. They felt that just being accused was enough to make them the guilty party, leaving them in this state of just blank bewilderment as they watched themselves lose custody of their kids and get buried in legal fights they had no chance of winning.
So if you step back and look at the big picture here, what did it all add up to? Well, out of all 59 men in the study, the results were just stark. Only 2, you heard me, just 2, said they had a positive experience with any of these formal systems. The huge, overwhelming majority said that trying to get help from police, the courts, or support agencies was a deeply, profoundly negative experience.
So the question is, why? Why was this so consistent across the board? Well, according to the men in the study, all these individual bad experiences, they weren't just random. They were all symptoms of a much bigger problem, a set of really deep-seated biases in our society. And these are the core biases they felt they were constantly fighting against. This idea that a male victim is basically a myth, something that doesn't really exist. The default stereotype that men are always the aggressors. This feeling that the legal system just automatically favors women. And then you have our cultural ideas about masculinity, which basically punish men for showing any vulnerability. And all of that is made worse by a real, concrete lack of resources designed for them.
This last quote from one of the participants, man, it just perfectly sums up what happens when all those biases pile up. It's not about one bad phone call or one bad day in court. It's this profound feeling of being completely lost in the system, with literally nowhere to go and no one who will even listen.
So, what this study really leaves us with is a huge critical question. And this isn't about taking away from anyone else's experience. It's about making our understanding bigger. How do we start to build a society where our systems, the stories we tell, and our support networks are actually set up to recognize, believe, and really help all victims of partner violence, no matter who they are?